What is up? What is up, guys? This is RC Apologist, and you are tuning in to Theological Discussion. I am your host, RC Apologist. Anyways, welcome to the show where we try to do our best to get a theological discussion going on, and we are not having one with a believer this time. This is not anything new. We've done this kind of stuff before with people, and we this time have a furry on board for this, which again, not the first time that we've had a furry on board to discuss theological matters. We had Foxler of the Furry Raiders on a while back, and then we recently had what Fusky, Haven Fusky, from the person that started the Good Fur News furry outlet thing for the news. So we've had furries that are also non-believers on before, and we have that same thing going on here. So again, we're not necessarily doing anything new, but this person and I were talking on Twitter and had an interaction about the issues of the Bible and having some truth in it. And when this person came out with the stuff, we basically told me to name some facts from the Bible, and I named a few of them, and then that seemed the main thing that gets stuck on it was, did Jesus exist? Is there any of that facts and evidence? And if anyone has seen the debate between me and Godless Engineer that took place on the Non Sequitur show a while back, y'all know that's where I definitely decided to hold up in a debate on that matter. But of course, the whole thing of this is nothing new to me as well. We've gone over this in Ask RC Apologist Q&A shows and all that. But anyways, we have a person on here that goes, the Twitter name being Shadow Wolf as the name. So we're gonna just go straight into it and get the introductions out the way. So Shadow, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
So you mentioned, and you have wanted the evidence of, let me see if I can recall what you said. You're saying, how do I know for a fact that he existed? Is that your answer or your question?
The main question was, is it really a fact that he existed?
Yes, it is. As far as what he would have been like, there's where the whole debates and the theories get at. But as far as for it being a fact, yeah, there is a fact and evidence of a figure by the name of Jesus that existed around that time period, and that he was crucified. Now, regarding of the identity of who exactly was this man, was he the one who invented Christianity? Was he just some guy that created a cult that went by a different belief structure and different title name? That is something that's on the debate aspect, and where I, of course, take the position that he was the founder of Christianity. But regardless of whether you have a belief or not, there was the fact that Jesus existed, as even atheist scholar Bart Ehrman pointed out.
Yeah, but I get stuck on the very beginning part. Is it actually a fact that he existed? What evidence is there to show that he actually did exist?
Well, we have the first part being of the not going to necessarily point out the other epistles, because there can be claims about that, though I will point out that there is a creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that scholars, even of non-religious groups, like the Jesus Seminar, point out that it is the earliest creed that has been pronounced of this figure of Jesus that existed. But the Gospels themselves are eyewitness accounts from Matthew, Mark, who is getting his information via Peter, one of the eyewitnesses, Luke, who is a historian that in his introduction is admitting that he's gathering his information from other eyewitnesses. That's why you sometimes see phrases where he's talking about the son of so-and-so when referring to somebody, because that indicates he's getting his info from that individual or that individual's relative. And then you have John himself. So you have two of them written directly by the eyewitnesses themselves, and two of them that are not eyewitnesses, but they're getting their information from eyewitnesses. Then you have Josephus, and then you have Tacitus in terms of their narratives.
Okay, real quick. I'm probably going to lose you here in about 5 minutes
Okay.
driving home. But
Mhm.
the biggest thing is, A, we don't know actually who wrote a majority of the Gospels. We know the only one that we know for sure of is Paul, who never actually met Jesus in person. He only had a vision of him.
Mhm.
Josephus is from, I believe, almost a century later. Um, the, do we actually have any evidence and actual eyewitness accounts? Because the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts; they are second, third, fourth, fifth-hand retellings of an account. Um, do we actually have any evidence? You know, eyewitness evidence, actual people who have met Jesus,
Mhm.
and you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Just wrote down their encounter.
Mhm. Well, again, I would have to ask where you get the idea that the Gospels are second to third century documents. And
I didn't say second or third century for the Gospels. I was talking about Josephus, but
okay,
we don't actually know who wrote the Gospels. And I believe the earliest dated Gospel is from 60 years after the supposed existence of Christ.
well, wait, well, with terms of the issue, I think you would be referring to the Gospel of John as being the latest, and that would be more so about the dating being about 80 to 90 AD would be the estimated time as to when John wrote that Gospel.
Which means that there's no way that the person that wrote that would have met Jesus.
How so?
Because the average age back then, granted, everyone's different, but
Yeah.
but the average age back then was about 40 to 50 years old.
Hmm.
There's no way they would have met Jesus and then wrote about it 60, 70 years later.
Well, you said there were exceptions, though, so couldn't this have been that one instance where that would be it?
Not really, because even if they did meet Jesus, they would have been an infant at that time.
Okay.
They would not
So,
have been, mentally cogent to remember and talk and, study what was going on.
okay. So you said it'd been about 40 to 50 years would be an average lifespan for them.
From what I remember, I don't have anything in front of me right now, but
Okay. So since we mentioned Josephus, do you know how long he lived?
I believe to his 80s.
Well, he actually lived to be 63, but even if you had thought at 80s, I mean, then wouldn't he have been violating that?
Yeah, he still would have, because he wouldn't have even been alive at the time Jesus would have walked the earth.
Okay. So then what about Tacitus?
I don't know when Tacitus was actually written, but from what I've studied with Tacitus, it was just merely speaking of that there are people who believe this, not necessarily that this is what happened.
Well, he was saying that there was an individual named Christus,
They
which
believe there was
no,
Christos,
he
which
didn't.
is the
He
Savior.
didn't. He didn't. They say because they believed of some man, they believed something about him, but he said that there was this person named Christus who they got the name from. So he was basically talking about the group, but he talked about where they got their name from, and it wasn't saying that they got it from some fictional name, but rather they got it from someone
But
that did exist that went by that title, and they just, and according to, and note that his account is being very anti-Christian in the account, that he's basically saying this is where they're getting the name from, that they're trying to borrow something from a man.
by the way, if I lose you, it's going to be like in the next 30 seconds.
Okay.
Um, Christus is a title meaning the Savior. It's not actually part of Jesus' name. So,
Right.
I
Oh,
probably lost.
yeah, we're getting a little bit of a thing there. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So you're saying that it was not part of his name, but it was a part of a title, right?
It was a title, yeah.
Right. And I would not have any disagreements or doubts about that. In fact, I point out that that's exactly what is needed to be known about the whole thing about Tacitus and all that. But even then, other people were also just known by their uh, titles as well.
But if I could, can I just turn this right back to the beginning, which is, what good reason do we have to actually believe that this individual actually existed? Because we have the Bible, which is the only claim, quote unquote, that we have that would be remotely, indicative of, hey, this person existed. Telling of his life, telling of things he did.
Right.
That's all we have. We don't have anyone else in history writing about the accomplishments and actions taken by what arguably would be the greatest person ever to exist.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Not a single person was writing about Jesus outside of the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
which, granted, I understand is a collection of 66 books, but you know what I mean.
Right. But it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that would be usually like an argument of silence, that because none of these people had mentioned, especially like other historians at that time, that they didn't write about like every single detail that is going on here. I mean,
Well,
but the problem with that is that there's actually other times where we see this kind of thing happen. In fact, there was something I believe was from Josephus, and forget what the book is, but it's in Antiquities. But it talks about Herod Archelaus. He slaughtered several Jews in a temple, and he canceled the Passover celebration in Jerusalem. This is something that a Jewish historian is talking about a man named Herod Archelaus, and people do accept that this is indeed a historical fact, and we'll point out to Josephus on this. But the other thing is as well is that there's likewise no other historical sources seem to mention it, and he's only writing this because he's someone that has managed to uh, remember what his Jewish ancestors had been through, and is the one Jew that's able to help preserve those memories in a collection of historical writings dedicated to the history and the sufferings and the trials of the Jews, which is why he wrote Antiquities in the first place. So that is an instance where a big event happened that definitely was affecting people, but yet Josephus seems to be the only one that's really writing about it. So would you say
But
Herod Archelaus never slaughtered Jews in the temple?
but here's the thing though, with that particular situation,
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing magical or out there about something like that happening. It's not going to change realistically anyone's, day or anything. It's not going to affect anyone's life if that happened or not. There's no real historical significance to that actually happening, which was why I'm sure most people are like, okay, sure, it happened. Okay, and what? You know, there's nothing controversial about that claim
Mm-hmm.
because we
Right.
know stuff like that has happened all throughout history.
Right, but that wasn't your argument originally. All you simply said was that because someone wrote this and then nobody else wrote anything else
But yeah,
mentioning this stuff.
but we're talking about the supposedly greatest human being slash God to ever exist, ever.
Right.
The most amazing human being, sinless, perfect in every way, and not a single person wrote about that. That other person, Herod, and the killing of the Jews, not really a great person, not really magical, not really, savior of all mankind. Granted, most Jews did not accept Jesus to be the savior. But, I mean, the whole thing is, it's like, sorry, trying to get my words out. You have the greatest human being of all time, and not a single person wrote about it. It's not really remarkable if nobody writes about a nobody doing something. If nobody ever wrote that Reformed Christian apologist had a YouTube channel, it's not really controversial if in 100 years somebody says, hey, there was this person that, had this YouTube channel. It's not controversial. But if somebody were to try and say, Reformed Christian apologist was the Son of God and walked the earth and was perfect,
Mm-hmm.
that would be a controversial claim.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Especially if nobody had mentioned it. It's almost equivalent, I would say, to no one mentioning Hitler existing and the actions that he took until today's day. And the first people, if we had no recollection and no historical evidence and documents of Hitler
Mhm.
existing and the things that he did, do you think that people would just accept claims that were made today about Hitler if they had nothing else?
Well, it depends on where the source is that they're getting it from. That would have to be the
Does
whole.
it matter what the sources are? If there
Mhm.
was absolutely nothing, you had never heard of him before, there was no textbooks, no history, no outswitch, none of that, and all of a sudden you have, doesn't matter if it's the greatest historian in the world, said, hey, there was this person that existed 70 years ago and killed 6 million Jews.
Mhm.
Do you think that would be something people would accept or, even buy into if there
Concerning that
was
whole
no
thing.
evidence presented before today?
Well, concerning the whole thing, I'm saying, and I'm thinking the same would be in the analogy that people would affirm that there would have been a person named Hitler, that it existed, and that the person that comes 70 years later just never seen or heard of the guy or even seen anything until he comes across this guy that's pointing it out. And again, if he has data and actually being a historian that can have access to that, much like Josephus and Tacitus, who were being historians and had information before the fire that occurred and were able to have access to that information and data, were able to record that in the history work, then yes, I think that those works would be considered reliable and authentic
But
concerning
but
those
all
accounts.
they but all they have is a mere mention. They don't. Josephus doesn't go into detail about Jesus' life. Doesn't
Right,
mention any of the feats that he did. Neither does Tacitus.
right, and that's why
No,
there are
nobody
again.
else mentions anything about his life other than,
Right,
hey, there are these people. They worship this guy, and yeah.
right, which is
I mean,
why I said that there are theories about who exactly Jesus was. Like, yeah, the Jesus Seminar that has a different view and look at Jesus compared to how Christians today view him. Like Bart Ehrman of Jesus Seminar believes that all that Jesus was your average apocalyptic preacher during that time period, which was a very common thing to have, and that he was, instead of the idea of Christians believe that he's establishing his kingdom in heaven, that he believed that Jesus was talking about preaching of that I'm coming during my lifetime to reign down and be ruler and king on my own kingdom on earth now, is what he believes, that this is what who Jesus is and what his ideas are, and this is what was being promoted by the Jesus Seminar type of scholars. So again, yes, you have a mention that don't mention all the details, but you still have theories that you can work on based on some of the manuscripts of the Gospels that, with Ehrman and them, they see that there are different variants and they have their reasons why that's the case, as well as the other accounts from Josephus and Tacitus that they're using to work with that.
I mean, I'm not really good at debating, so
Well,
just
don't consider it a debate. Just have like a conversation where we're just going over some stuff.
it back to what you said about 2 or 3 minutes ago. I don't see somebody saying that Jesus actually did exist as a controversial claim,
Right.
but I don't see any evidence that he did exist. And so until I see any evidence that he actually was a real person, I
Mhm.
see no reason to accept that he was.
Okay. So when it comes to the Gospels, you say that the unreliability is that we don't have any mention. Well, you mentioned that we don't know who wrote them, but you said, I believe you would also believe that because there's miracle accounts written in them, that would kind of disprove their authenticity.
Well, miracles happen every single day. I mean, in essence, people say, "Oh, I didn't die in that train wreck. It's a miracle." I mean,
Right, but you know what I mean
there's
by
not
that, like supernatural kind of stuff.
reason to accept that those things did happen because there's no evidence that they can happen.
Right, but
If there was ever definitive proof that something like raising of the dead in Jerusalem and um, what's other things like the temple splitting open when someone dies, if something like that were to happen, there'd be evidence and be it's like, okay, yeah, I believe that did happen.
Mhm. Right. And I believe that there is actually an argument that has been made that there are people that have experienced something like describing what would be ultimately in the whole splitting of the tomb kind of argument. But other than that, there again, I want to point out, like, I understand like the whole thing of what we understand as miracles, but I think what you would mean though be like something that is supernatural, something that is like not um, of this world, essentially.
Well, let me say this. I don't accept the Gospels as truth because there's no evidence that anything that they say happened actually did happen.
Okay.
And there's no evidence that any of the special actually happened.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Are you a person that enjoys doing research and being open-minded on these kinds of things?
I wouldn't necessarily say open-minded. I'm actually a fairly closed-minded person that if I don't see evidence for something, I don't accept it.
Okay.
I'll never accept a claim until there's been proof or evidence that, hey, this can actually happen.
So if someone were to claim that they would have proof of that kind of stuff, would you be willing to look into that then? If someone did claim and have that evidence in some form, like a book or a paper?
I would be willing to look into it if it's not something I've already looked at. I mean, I'm not going to look at something I've already looked at and said, this is BS, but I don't understand how anyone can actually get evidence for something that happened 2,000 plus years ago from a book written today.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't, straight up say, hey, this is where there is evidence. This is how, where it's written down, it's transcribed in stone, whatever, this
Right.
is where the evidence is, and this is how we know. If you can't just simply say, hey, this is where that evidence is it really evidence? You shouldn't need a whole dissertation to show where evidence is of something existing.
Well, that's the thing, is that there's people that, have seen this as evidence, and there's now just recently starting to become this whole skepticism on the whole thing. And that's why then people are going into it to show, okay, if there is doubt on this, let's answer all these questions that are on that. And one of those books, though there's a shorter form that was published in 1987 called The Historical Reliability of the Gospels, has now been updated into The Historical Reliability of the New Testament. And the book that's about 800 pages that goes over all these facts and data. And I used this during the debate I had with Godless Engineer, but concerning that, like, we know because of for example, the early church fathers, that which, if they're going to make stuff up and try to attribute different names to it, it's going to be quite interesting that they're going to get the same names in especially the different regions that would outline and outmap where the Christian population would have been during, say, give or take, the second to third century of Christendom. So when we have those names then being going around, we think we have a good accountability there. And then you have the manuscripts themselves that point this out. But then again, of course, that doesn't automatically mean that they're true, right? So how do we then know they're true? And I think the issue is going over the historical account, what do you call them? Criterions of historicity. And when you have things like, for example, criteria embarrassment, like it would be embarrassing, for example, and not really something to be considered reliable at that time if, for example, they used the whole thing about women were the one that discovered that Jesus was resurrected. Because back then they viewed a woman's testimony, and again, not by Christian standards, because there were no Christians at that time yet. This was about the pagans. The pagans and the such were not
Jews.
Right, and they would not accept the testimony of a woman at that time during the Greco-Roman period. They basically viewed a woman's testimony as unreliable. And so to use that, if you're trying to make that your selling point, especially for part of it relying on the resurrection, that would be a really bad starting point to point out that it's the women that discovered the tomb, and then you have majority of the town just simply laughing it off and dismissing it, and then Christianity would easily be able to die at that point. But it doesn't, as we see, because people manage to somehow find there is truth in that statement, even though knowing that there were women that founded it. So that's one thing.
Yeah, but was it actually women?
Huh? Yeah.
Do we actually know who found the tomb?
So far, the names we have are the two Marys: Mary, the mother of Jesus, and then Mary Magdalene. And then and then we have a couple of the other women that are mentioned as disciples, and that's only based off of what we get on the accounts. For all we know, there could have been more than what either of the gospel accounts give us concerning that. All we have is just what each of the gospel authors wanted to make known in their point regarding that. So there could have been more women at the tomb for all we know.
But the thing is, you have 4 different retellings of who was actually at the tomb. You actually know that that's what happened?
Right, and that's actually even stronger evidence concerning the different accounts.
Sorry, just got home.
No, you're good. But no, yeah, as I was saying, that's actually the fact that they're having different accounts of that. The 4 different gospels telling 4, like you have at one point just says Mary the mother, and then Mary the disciple, and then it adds more people in a different gospel. And like I said, that's actually, again, stronger evidence for this being a historical case, because again, not only does it then have that whole thing of the criterion embarrassment, then you have that this is being a genuine, authentic, trying to retell history from their own perspective and trying to give their account without conspiring to make up a story. It would be more likely a fictional story that they just decide to gather up and make up for benefit if every single gospel was worded the same exact way, word for word.
Sorry. Can we do this like another night?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Sorry, I just got home. My AC's broke.